Welcome everybody to another in our series of enterprise webinars. My name's Esther Carter. I'm a partner here at Kingsley Smith, and I will be doing a little bit of light chairing today to make sure everything stays on track. Today we're going to be talking about combating fraud, prevention, detection and recovery. So if you were expecting to hear us talk about setting up in China, you are in the wrong webinar. So lots of familiar faces and a really popular demand for today's webinar, which I think is indicative of the topic and what we're kind of seeing constantly in news and things. So quite a few familiar faces on the delegate list. We do get our sort of repeat attendees to these webinars, which is good. So probably a lot of you do know who we are, but for those of you that are less familiar, Kingsley Smith is a top 10 audit, tax and advisory firm. We work with entrepreneurial businesses across lots of different sectors, as well as not-for-profit and private clients. So I mean, the consequences of fraud can really impact many areas of an organisation, and victims of fraud can experience lots of different negative consequences, such as regulatory action, loss in the business, reputational damage, and compensation claims. And threats can come from a whole variety of sources, including actually your own employees, which is possibly one people don't consider quite so much. So our expert panel is going to guide you through the steps that you need to take to prevent, detect and react to fraudulent activity. So I'm delighted to be joined today by our three panelists, Ricky, Maritz and Richard. So Ricky O'Connell is a member of our forensic team here at Kingsley Smith and recently returned from a year-long secondment at the Serious Fraud Office. And he works primarily on fraud investigations, but also works on other forensic matters like business valuations and loss of profit claims with the wider team. Maritz Cloet is a director and lead consultant in our more ClearCom business, where we provide our clients with advisory services around cybersecurity and other data protection matters. And last but not least, we have Richard Clayman, who is a partner at Kingsley Napley, and he specialises in dispute resolution with a particular focus on civil fraud cases and disputes also involving shareholders, directors and partnerships. So welcome to our panel. So before we kick off, just a little bit of housekeeping. It'll be really good if everyone asks questions. It's always much more interesting if people ask questions, and it can be a little bit interactive, and I'll try and weave those questions into the pre-prepared questions I have for the panel. So if you do want to ask questions, please pop them in the Q&A function, not the chat function, the Q&A function, please, because it's much easier to keep track of them there. The session is being recorded, so please do share it with any peers, friends, colleagues, anyone who couldn't make it today who you think will be interested in the topic. And a little plug for our next Enterprise Series webinar, which is the Thursday even, the 14th of December, where we're going to be looking at embedding learning and development in your organisation. So I think we'll kick off maybe with a question sort of more directed at you, Ricky. So, I mean, how does fraud impact your business? And are you able to give any sort of examples from the cases that you're working on at the moment or worked on recently?
Thanks, Esther. Hello, everyone. I think generally people think mainly about loss of funds when they're talking about fraud, but actually the implications are far wider reaching and they can have a serious material impact on a company. So, for example, I was recently working on a case where we had a director who'd been misappropriating funds of a significant value over a number of years. So once that gets unearthed, that director needs to be exited from the business. There's no handover period. The impact is immediate. In this instance, we had a director who had key relationships with company clients, lots of knowledge of nuances of the businesses, services provided. So that's immediately gone. So the remaining directors need to adapt pretty quickly to ensure you've got no lasting impact on the company and there's no impact on the company's reputation. And then after that, you've got the impacts, the tax implications of the misappropriation. So you'd expect personal expenditure to be recorded in a director's loan account. So obviously that wasn't happening. So you would normally have, when the personal expense is incurred, the company's cash balance goes down, but the director's loan account balance goes up. So that's just on your balance sheet. It doesn't impact your profit and loss account. So that's a net nil impact. What actually happens is the cash was going down and the expenses were going up. So your pre-tax profits are depressed on a pound for pound basis for that expense. So you need to adjust for those expenses. So that has significant tax implications. So you've got corporation tax because you haven't been paying your corporation tax on those profits. You've got VAT issues because you would have been reclaiming the VAT on those expenses. You've got PAY issues, possibly benefit in kind issues. And if you have a deliberate fraud, you can have fines from HMRC, which I think can be as much as 100% of the tax due plus interest. So that could be, that can be as much as the misappropriation in itself. And then as well as that, you've got, is the director also a shareholder? So how do you exit that shareholder from the business? You don't want them to still be able to make decisions on behalf of the company. And if they owe more than their shares are worth, then that's less problematic. But if their shareholding is worth more and you don't have the shareholder provisions, then how do you resolve that? So in the case I had, we had a company that was actually being very profitable, even with the misappropriation, to actually taking solvency advice. So the implications are far wider reaching. They're not just limited to the cash that's been misappropriated.
Thanks, Ricky. Oh, lights dimming. Richard, you got anything to add? Any good examples from things you've been working on?
I certainly think Ricky's hit on a really key point, which is that it's really easy to think about fraud in fairly two-dimensional terms, simply as being the extraction of money done in a way that involves some kind of deception. And I think that characterization probably accounts for most fraud. But it's certainly worth bearing in mind that from a legal perspective, fraud covers so many different types of behaviour. There's no single definition of what it is. To illustrate that point, under the Fraud Act 2006, you can be guilty of fraud for 3 different types of conduct, but there are other criminal statutes with other behaviours that are also fraud offences. And it doesn't get any clearer in my field, which is civil litigation. You'll regularly find a civil fraud claim that can involve deceit, conspiracy, dishonest assistance. I mean, those are sort of your typical claims. But a lot of civil fraud claims don't even need to actually entail any deception at all, which I think most people think is the sort of key ingredient when you're thinking about fraud. We've probably got some audience members who are involved in finance or consumer lending, and they'll probably be familiar with the concept of undue influence. That's a situation where, because of a particular power dynamic in a relationship of trust, one party has control over the other. And that's characterized in certain instances as constructive fraud as well. And that has ramifications where, for example, a bank, where they are faced with parties that they are lending to, where there is an undue influence situation, they can be affected by that despite having absolutely no influence over the parties involved, and can end up losing out despite not being, as it were, a wrongdoer. I think another illustration of the quite nuanced and expansive impact of fraud is how bribery is now looked at and dealt with. Because bribery is, again, another species of fraud. And if your business is involved in it, either as the giver or the receiver of a bribe, there can be certainly civil consequences, reputational damage, severe criminal sanctions. But specifically, I mentioned bribery because of the Bribery Act 2010, which has opened up a whole new frontier in terms of impact on businesses in relation to fraud. And that's this new failure to prevent offence. And that's essentially an offence that places criminal responsibility on a business that fails to ensure its people do not commit bribery. And as of this year, that failure to prevent offence has now been extended to fraud more generally for large organisations under the Economic Crime and Transparency Act. So really, now that when we talk about the impact of fraud on business, and the need to prevent it, it's no longer measured simply in terms of a victim perspective, but you've also got to look at now the steps you have to take to ensure that fraud doesn't happen on your watch.
Somebody's asked what is sort of the difference, if any difference, between fraud versus theft, and how you might classify as one or the other, or is there no real difference?
So from a criminal law perspective, I won't sort of blunder into that as I'm a civil litigator. The two different things in civil law, there is something called the tort of conversion, which is effectively the equivalent of theft. And that could be an aspect of a fraud claim. And if you read up certain legal textbooks, you'll actually find conversion is referred to in texts around fraud. So they can certainly be part and parcel. And that's sort of going back to the point that there's no one single definition.
So I'm sure there's a very long list here, but what sort of steps can a business take to help prevent against fraud?
So as a civil litigator, I tend to become involved when fraud's already happened. And sadly, I rarely get to give that before the event advice. But I've learned an awful lot from the post-mortem that comes with every fraud case that I work on. The most critical step, if you're going to prevent fraud in your organization, is about understanding where the weaknesses are in your business. And while that's very true for a startup business, it's certainly not exclusive to them, because as businesses grow, take on new functions, develop new systems, generate more revenue, hire more staff, it's rare that people during that process take a step back, look at the entire system and see where the vulnerabilities lie. So for anyone looking to assess their business, I think it's good to think about 3 distinct spheres. And I'll go through the sorts of questions you should be asking yourself, but by no means an exhaustive list of questions. And this is really a sense check and an audit of how you are set up. The first of the 3 spheres to look at is how you interact with third parties. And that's your customers, your suppliers, your competitors, but also, your typical sort of external bad actors. And I'm not talking about Sylvester Stallone. I'm talking about your hackers and your scammers. You need to gauge your business's trading vulnerability, and the sort of examples of the type of questions you need to ask are, and probably this is the most typical one, how are your payment processes managed? And we touched on it earlier, but how do you go about confirming, for example, you've got the correct outbound payment details for your suppliers? Do you just rely on the email instruction that they've sent you, or do you verify that information by other means? This is huge. This probably accounts for most of the cyber fraud inquiries that we see. Another question, are your IT systems robust against a cyber attack? And I don't know, Moritz is going to expand on this, so I won't say any more. For regulated businesses, we all know we have anti-money laundering procedures, but are yours up to scratch? And even if you're not a regulated business, do you or would you be able to spot a risk that you're receiving proceeds of crime? An example of this, I once acted against an online gambling company that had effectively turned a blind eye to a punter who was spending huge amounts of money on a weekly basis, and this was our client's money. And it ought to have raised alarm bells. And as a result of the case, the gambling operator agreed to repay our client all of the money that the fraudster had gambled away on the site. Another question, how would you go about checking the authenticity and quality of your stock? And that's a supply chain investigation issue. I think probably an example that sticks in the mind there, which perhaps many people will remember, is that the supermarkets discovered that their beef products contained horse meat, up to 100% in cases. So it's really analysing where your product line comes from in those cases. Similarly, creditworthiness of your customers, age-old scam, new customer sets up business with you, pays a few of the first invoices, places a big order, disappears without paying the bill. One final point, which I think is often overlooked, is how you interact with your competitors. Now, how would you go about ensuring that people who do interact with your competitors don't run the risk of being construed as being part of bid rigging or cartel behavior? So those are all sort of questions looking at your third parties. The next sphere that you need to think about is your employees. Think about how you vet them, how you interview them. Are those processes fit for purpose for the roles you're recruiting for? Do you need to get enhanced background checking for people that you're bringing into your organization? And then once they're in, do you have systems in place to spot at-risk employees? And these are employees, for example, that maybe due to their circumstances and the access they have are under some pressure or to commit or become implicated in a fraud. There are various situations that give rise to that. It could be financial hardship, can be addiction, can be due to relationships that employees are in. Obviously, that requires real sensitivity and deftness to look into that, but it's an important factor you have to think about. Likewise, think about the roles and where those roles place business assets at risk and how they're monitored. Another example, I had a case against a fairly low-level engineer who was responsible for testing different rig setups in a lab, but he had access to very specialized parts, and he was essentially sneaking those out of the building and selling them on eBay. And it wasn't even his employer that cottoned on to the fact he was doing this. It was a competitor that recognized the parts and knew they must have come from our client, and so raised the alarm. I think probably here, and this is very critical, when dealing or when looking at your employee sphere, you need to think about what training and policies you've got in place for your employees. And that's both how they can spot fraud, but also how to prevent it. And critically now, in terms of the Bribery Act and the Economic Crime and Transparency Act, are those policies and that training sufficient to give you a defence under the offences of those acts? Because your employees, while they present a possible fraud risk, they're also probably the best protection you have to stop a fraud from taking place, whether that's from an internal source or from a third party. Now, the third and final sphere, and I'll try and tackle this quickly, is essentially looking at how your business is managed. First and foremost amongst that, and touching on Ricky's point from earlier, is how good is your board oversight? Is one board member dominant, or can the others hold them to account? Similar to Ricky, the current case on at the moment, where one director had been responsible for the financial and operational management of a global multi-million-dollar company for a very long period of time. And lo and behold, they misappropriated many millions of dollars. And now we're trying to recover that. And that's where board oversight is absolutely critical. Again, clear reporting lines throughout the management structure. Do people know how to raise concerns and who to raise them to? Do you have a whistleblower policy? Are your auditors, whether internal or external, given a proper mandate and empowered to look for fraud within your business? And again, are you aware sufficiently of how overseas activities are being conducted? That's, again, really important in the context of the Bribery Act and now the Economic Crime and Transparency Act, because those both have extraterritorial effect for that very reason.
Ricky, have you got anything to add?
I might add a few bits on that. I mean, I entirely echo what Richard's saying, and there's probably a bit of overlap with what I have to add. But I mean, from an accountancy perspective, there are some basic processes and procedures which should be in place at any business. I mean, segregation of duties is a basic in risk management for a business. I mean, the aim is to ensure it's not possible for one person to carry out two stages of the same task, basically. So someone shouldn't be able to authorize and process a payment as well. So having correct authorization, access levels, so payments over certain values need to be authorized by certain individuals, having the right people at the right levels of access at the different stages of the process. You know, are your passwords safely secured, or are they known by everyone? I mean, everyone in the office shouldn't have access to your banking information. You know, it's a lot of it is common sense stuff, but that's kind of, you know, a basic framework of what you need at a business. So, I mean, notwithstanding that, I think they're pretty fundamental anyway. But I think actually the best tool against preventing fraud is probably just having a general awareness that fraud can happen, what types of fraud can happen, and having a healthy dose of professional skepticism, and just generally not taking people at face value, and almost thinking about whether things pass the smell test. And sometimes a good way of thinking whether something passes the smell test is, if you were to tell someone else about what was happening, would you think twice about telling them? Would you be a little bit embarrassed and then maybe not tell them? Because if that's the case, then that probably doesn't pass the smell test. And that can really help with things like phishing, which I think Maritz will probably touch on a bit later. So, you know, if someone's asking you to transfer money to a new account, if you were to tell someone else you're about to do it, they'd probably say, don't do that. That doesn't sound right. But sometimes it takes you to say it out loud, or to think about saying it out loud, to think maybe actually you shouldn't be doing it. And then linking to the whistleblowing point that Richard mentioned, I mean, is generally having a speak up culture within the organization, a general willingness for people to want to do the right thing and not let things slide. You need to make sure within your organization that if people have any issues or suspicions, that they can talk to someone anonymously if needed, without fear of repercussions.
Thank you. Somebody's asked, does fraud always involve some form of monetary, personal or business gain by an individual or company? For instance, could it include things like competitive advantage or IP misappropriation?
Absolutely.
Possibly, one for you, Richard, I think.
It certainly can, yeah. So, I mean, certainly it can be just misappropriation of stock. So it doesn't necessarily involve, as it were, cash value. It can take the form of misappropriation of shares, misappropriation of crypto assets and other things like that. So really, the nature of different frauds and how they become actionable is quite a wide thing. Unfortunately, it's probably we don't have time enough to sort of go through all the various types, but certainly it can involve other types of assets, not just sort of cash and cash value.
And where there aren't perfect fraud prevention measures in place, what would you suggest that businesses do to help themselves?
I think I suppose there's probably an element of elaboration on some of the points I've made earlier, but where you don't already have a nice Rolls-Royce fraud protection package in place, then in order to be able to detect fraud early, I think there's three really key things. And first of all is knowing your business and what the red flags look like. And I think Ricky's going to say a bit more about that, so I won't go into that. But the next point is having good, effective record keeping and monitoring. Where a business has been a victim of fraud, its chances of making a recovery are immeasurably increased if it's got clear, detailed records which are being regularly reviewed by someone who really understands and knows what they're looking at. And whether that's stock monitoring, call notes, purchase orders, bank statements, board minutes, diary appointments, anything like that, the contemporaneous evidence that you've got will tell a story in court. Fraudsters are very often incredibly convincing in court and great performers. So where you don't have any independent documentary evidence to back up your case, you then instead have the challenge of trying to get a sort of dyed-in-the-wool liar to crack under cross-examination, and that is not easy. And I think the third thing is having a well-established fraud reporting procedure, because it's really important to act quickly. People at the coalface, in particular, people who are monitoring bank accounts, they need to know what to do. So if you've got a clear and accessible fraud reporting procedure, then that will greatly assist in both tackling or stemming a fraud that's sort of in progress, or otherwise getting you on the front foot to make a quick recovery.
Thank you. And somebody asked a sort of put in a pre question, and that was, what is the safest way to collect sensitive information from someone, for example, their bank details? Are there particular encryption packages we should be using, or is WhatsApp enough?
I think I'll probably take that one. I think we had a quick discussion before the webinar started on this one amongst us, and I think the answer there was, I think every single way of transferring data, especially sensitive information like bank details, has got a risk associated with it. Whether you do it over the phone, so somebody could be impersonating somebody on the phone, whether you're using WhatsApp, where the details then stay on the mobile phones as well, potentially. I think it's very much about having a solid process in place in terms of how you take payments and understanding the risk of those payment recording mechanisms, whether you do it via a website, whether you use existing client accounts that maybe uses two-factor authentication to verify who that person is before they change their details. It really depends. I don't think there's a right answer or wrong answer on this one. It's down to having a solid process within the business that's properly risk assessed and making sure that the right measures are put in place around the channel that you want to use to exchange that information. So yeah, so no specific answer for that one, unfortunately.
Thank you. So when fraud is discovered, how does a business go about handling it and tackling it, Richard?
So I think it's the best situation you can be in is to have your sort of Rolls-Royce, your tailor-made fraud response plan for your business that can be implemented very quickly. And that should really cover 8 points. Sort of try and get them through them quickly. First of all, you should know who your legal advisors are going to be, and you should get in contact with them. Without wanting to sound too alarmist, if you've got a law firm that doesn't deal with litigation, then you should find one, and I can personally recommend a very good one. But it's really important to contact people who know what they are doing in these circumstances and who can help, because there are plenty of sad instances where if you're a victim of fraud, you go to your local high street guy who doesn't have the experience, and that first response is then either slow or it's not particularly effective, and that may scupper your chance of recovering anything. Then you've got to identify and assemble your internal response team. So it's really critical to delegate responsibility for investigating fraud and pursuing it via any legal action to a group with authority and expertise to do it properly. That can include your directors, financial controllers, your in-house legal team, IT specialists. But it's important that the group's clearly defined and know what they are doing. It's critical that communications concerning any initial investigation and then ensuing legal action remain confidential within the group. That's particularly important to ensure that there's no risk of tipping a fraudster off, but it's also important to preserve legal professional privilege in communications between the legal team and internal response, because if those communications are then shared outside the team, their privilege can be lost. They could be disclosable in ensuing proceedings. Point 3, preserve your records. As I've said, it's akin to preserving the crime scene. In civil proceedings as well, it's once a party becomes aware of litigation, they're under a duty to preserve all documents in their possession or control that could become relevant in future proceedings. And that can mean making sure that a routine document destruction policy is put on hold, that your texts, your WhatsApp messages are all secured, hard drives and mobile phones are imaged, hard copies are located and preserved. And it's really important that you do that, because failure to do so could have adverse consequences to your case later on. Likewise, similarly, getting your witnesses identified, and if you can, to get a detailed account of events from people with relevant information while the information is still fresh in memory. Again, there's a bit of a caveat there that there are now very strict rules in some civil proceedings and how witness statements are taken. So it's important to be very careful in how you interview witnesses in terms of what information and documents you share with them, because there's a risk of essentially contaminating their own memory or prompting them to an answer that they wouldn't otherwise come to. It's ultimately a situation best left to your lawyers, but we'll park that there. This will probably be an obvious one, but take immediate action to prevent any further loss. This could be involving cancelling a bank card, contacting your bank to make sure it can cancel a payment, or even contacting the recipient bank to say that the payment that they've received has been made fraudulently. Likewise, it may involve locking down an IT system or even physical infrastructure. 5th point, know what it is you're looking for. Do you want to recover your loss, or do you want to see a wrongdoer brought to justice? In the former case, you'd be pursuing civil proceedings, and in the latter case, you're likely to be making a criminal report. You can also pursue a private prosecution, and I'll come to that in a moment. You could, of course, pursue both, but pressure on time and resources in an unfolding situation often mean you have to focus on one, at least at the outset. Both have pros and cons. We'll sort of come to those in a moment. Point 6, think about any external reporting requirements you have to make. So if you're regulated, you may have to report.
May I have your attention, please? Fire has been reported.
Where's that? Do you need to exit the building?
I've got a fire alarm, potentially. Sorry.
Okay.
I put myself on mute.
So you may need to comply with regulatory requirements to report fraud, or you may have to think about, if you've got insurance that covers fraud losses, check the terms, see if you need to make a report and notification under that in order not to vitiate the terms of the policy. Point 7, think about whether you can get an interim court order to hold the ring. Come on to that again in a second in more detail. Point 8, and this is a really important and often overlooked point, think about how you are going to manage your internal and external communications in order to protect business reputation. Listed companies obviously need to be really careful in that regard, but the aftermath of fraud is often a really stressful time for all concerned. Mistakes can be made due to comms being sent out in the heat of the moment without proper thought. And so it's important to ensure that you've got a communication strategy that's well managed, both within your organisation and externally. Often your lawyers can help with that, but there are crisis PR firms that also help.
And a couple of questions come in. At what stage do you sort of move from an internal investigation to getting external support, and maybe sort of weaving in with that as well, how do you approach a person who's committed fraud? Because isn't there a risk of threats to either the person approaching them or the families of the person approaching them?
I'd say in my experience, it's very fact specific. I would say as a general rule, it's good to get your legal, and I'm not sort of a sales pitch, but it is good to get your legal team involved sooner rather than later. And that's for reasons of preserving legal professional privilege and also ensuring that those internal investigations are handled as sensitively as possible. Where you've got an external firm assisting an internal investigation, either by taking evidence or so on, that then just adds a layer of protection between the business and creates some legal privilege, professional privilege over information that's exchanged. So that's often very helpful. In terms of how you manage a fraudster and try and ensure that there's no sort of risk of escalation. That's, again, it's a very difficult one. Obviously, you don't want to tip fraudsters off. It may well be that you need to interview a fraudster as part of an investigation. And again, it's important that you've got protocols and procedures in place to deal with that. It's difficult to be more specific than that, unfortunately.
Okay, that's useful though, thank you. So Marit, maybe coming to you then, what's the sort of the link between cybersecurity and fraud?
No worries. So fraud, it's quite a traditional crime, isn't it? But I think fundamentally it can be increased in scale and reach through the use of computers and computers networks. We are all interconnected now. Businesses are interconnected. The users of those systems can be manipulated by a fraudster. And I think the biggest issue is fraud can now be committed from anywhere in the world, really, as long as you've got an internet connection point. They could potentially target a lot more companies and a lot more individuals within those companies as well, to try and find weak points within the organization to be able to exploit and then sort of carry out whatever fraud they want to do. So fraud, I mean, there's this term of cyber-enabled. It's a cyber-enabled crime. So when you look at it from a fraud perspective, the perpetrator's target is not the IT systems itself necessarily. They're still trying to get money or assets out of the business, but technology is really a significant force multiplier for a fraudster. So it can really drive up the capability and sort of the reach of that fraud. Interesting stats I just looked up from Action Fraud. They report basically more than 62% of all fraud cases reported in 2022 is cyber-enabled. And I think there was about 481,000 cases reported, which was about 2.6 billion loss. 300,000 of those were cyber-enabled. So 1.6 billion of the 2.6 are cyber-enabled. So, and also the other question is how many of those go unreported, how many frauds go unreported, which doesn't get to action fraud, because I know there's some issues around potentially people having sort of trust in action fraud in terms of being able to resolve issues, because you can see the volume of cases these guys have to deal with. So in some cases, it may not even be reported to action fraud. So the problem that might actually be sort of tip of the iceberg stuff, really, when it comes to fraud.
And what are the typical ways that fraudsters exploit cybersecurity weaknesses?
Yeah, so I guess you can look at it from an internal fraudster or an external fraudster. I think Ricky already picked up on some of the internal elements where if you've got weak access controls on your systems don't enforce things like segregation of duties and authorizations, then an internal fraudster might exploit those to be able to carry out transactions which they shouldn't transact, or potentially change data that they shouldn't be able to change, and thereby perpetrate their fraud, maybe doing it in such a way that's not easy to detect because they're modifying data on the system level. I think potentially one of the bigger risks is external fraudsters. So these are the guys who send phishing emails to your team, try and get into your team's email accounts, and then ultimately try and exploit your systems from that perspective, pretending to be employees, pretending to be suppliers, accessing systems, spending time within a business systems to learn business processes, understand where the weaknesses are, understand what the culture is in terms of management. Does management sort of dictate that payments need to be made, or is there proper process in place, for example? Because fraudsters are looking for ways to exploit weaknesses in your business processes as well. But if they're on your systems, then essentially they're in your office, for example, but they're not in your office because they're virtually in your office. So that's the challenge with cyber as well. It's not all that visible in terms of how fraudsters operate and whether fraudsters are in fact operating. Especially smaller businesses who don't really have the ability to detect suspicious behavior on their networks and on their systems are potentially significantly at risk of this as well.
And what can organisations do to combat this sort of angle that fraudsters are taking?
Yeah, I think linking in with what Richard and Ricky mentioned as well, I think staff awareness is fundamental in terms of knowing how fraudsters potentially approach staff and try and get them to do things they shouldn't through social engineering is the term we use. Also, that culture of trust but verify, the professional skepticism that Ricky talked about is absolutely key, even at a cyber level. So if you do get an email that may look a little bit dodgy, again, smell test. Somebody's like urgently wanting to change bank details on a supplier's account. Is that something that you should be doing? I think the second part of that is making sure that from a technical perspective, you are able to detect suspicious behaviors on the network. So that might be your IT service provider, being able to monitor your systems for potential strange logins from different countries if you don't expect it, for example, uncharacteristic emails from colleagues, any request to circumvent process. It does come back to good business process, because if you've got weak business processes around payments, for example, then it is quite likely that you will be could be exploited in that sense. And I think from a broader perspective, it's making sure that you just practice general good cybersecurity hygiene within your organization. So that's, for example, making sure that you've got cyber essentials, which is a UK standard for basic cyber hygiene, and also just following the National Cybersecurity's 10 steps towards cybersecurity.
So, fire alarm in the building that Ricky's in, unfortunately, has meant that he has had to leave the building. He did have a number of points to follow on from this. Maritz, I don't know, he has emailed those points over to you, Maritz. I don't know whether you want to just try and pick those up, just so we can make sure we've got a complete picture.
Yeah, so
I suspect he won't be back in time.
I think the bits that Ricky was going to cover off again was just professional skepticism, but also having processes in place within the business process side to potentially detect fraud at an early stage. Because I think, as both Richard and Ricky's mentioned, detection at an early stage is really important, because if you found a fraud happened 3, 4, 5 years ago, then there's very little you can probably do about that, at least from a recovery perspective, in my experience. I think another interesting perspective to look as well is if within the organization there's a resistance to actually putting tighter controls in place, specifically from specific areas, that could potentially be an indication that there might be something going on within the organization already that's not sort of above board, or may not pass the smell test. And the other sort of things that you can sort of look for as well is activities outside of normal working hours, for example, as well. So if there's late night postings in the financial system, we know we should be working, or on weekends, for example, as well. And then lastly, managing people's holidays. I think those of us working financial services know that the sort of enforced 2-week holidays throughout the year at some point is part of the fraud prevention process, because if that fraudster is out of the business, then potentially the activities might change within the organization, because that regular fraud activity doesn't take place, and you might be able to detect it then as well. So yeah, that's what I sort of picked up from the discussions from Ricky as well, and the few bits he sent me.
Thank you. And Richard, what can you sort of practically do if your organisation has been a victim of fraud?
Thanks. So I think having mentioned, I think having a plan in place is really important, and deploying it quickly and effectively is critical. But I think once you've discovered the fraud and you've got a sense of the lay of the land, then you've got several options. I think most people sort of jump straight to thinking criminal report is a sensible idea, and in certain instances, reporting to the police may be the best, or maybe even the only sensible option. Some companies also do it simply as a matter of policy. I think I typically see that choice being made often where, for a classic example is where an employee has misappropriated a fairly modest amount of funds, so not enough to pursue civil proceedings, but enough to want to see justice done. But it's quite complex, because police are generally overstretched when it comes to investigating fraud, and especially low-level fraud. Where they do investigate, it can take a long time. The process can be quite slow, and you don't have any control over it. And conversely, the threshold for getting something like the Serious Fraud Office involved is pretty high. Unfortunately, Ricky's not here to tell us how high that threshold is, but it's not your sort of everyday fraud that gets that level of attention. Another option is private prosecutions. They are something of a rarity. They would allow you, as a private individual or entity, to bring a criminal case against a wrongdoer in the shoes of a state prosecutor. Now, there are a number of really stringent procedural requirements on this part, probably too many to go into, but they're equivalent to those that are imposed on the state when bringing criminal cases. Because you're pursuing it yourself in a private capacity, they're often very expensive. Likewise, you can lose control of the case, because the state can take over control at any time, even if you want to discontinue. I think that the real attraction of this route is that you will see a wrongdoer jailed or potentially jailed. And that's some solace where the misappropriated assets have already been squandered. My personal favourite, of course, is civil proceedings. And these are brought in order to bring recovery of misappropriated assets. I think, as I mentioned right at the start, there are lots of different types of civil fraud claims, but the English courts are well known and they are well versed, well prepared to assist victims of fraud. They've been the primary destination for international fraud claims for quite a number of years. And this is in part because the English courts are very willing to make orders granting interim relief that hold the ring and tackle fraud cases. The sort of three classic examples are freezing injunctions, typically over bank accounts, but these stop assets from being dissipated where there is a risk that the wrongdoer would seek to evade judgment. These orders can even be granted on a worldwide basis, and they're incredibly powerful. Where a worldwide freezing injunction is granted, for example, the respondent has to disclose all of their assets over a certain value worldwide. They can only spend a prescribed amount on meeting their living expenses and their legal expenses. And if they breach the order or lie about the assets in their disclosure, they can be committed to prison for up to 2 years. And so can anyone who ignores the order and facilitates a breach of it. And as such, sometimes just getting that order at the very start of proceedings can be enough to bring about a very, very rapid settlement. Second other great tool is a search order. This allows your claimant solicitors, under the supervision of a third-party solicitor, to attend a respondent's premises and search for and seize specific items, typically financial records, computers, mobile phones, and then those can be imaged and preserved to ensure that the respondent can't destroy key evidence before a trial. The final really useful tool is a disclosure order. In fraud cases, these are very often obtained against banks, and that's either to discover who the owner of a specific bank account is and their address details, identity, and so on. Also, whether their misappropriated funds may still be in an account or whether that money has been transferred onto the identity of where it's gone. A really useful recent update to English civil procedure allows third-party disclosure orders to be served outside the jurisdiction. Now, this is really useful in that tracing exercise where money has been taken from a UK account and moved to an overseas account. There are lots of other interim remedies, and unfortunately I can't go into them all now.
That's fine, because we are near the witching hour. So I think we've got time for one final question, which is, what do you see, and maybe coming to you, Moritz, what do you see as being the biggest emerging fraud risks to businesses or individuals?
I guess the first one isn't so much emerging rather than a general observation, in that most organizations are still very reactive in terms of dealing with fraud. They're quick to obviously respond when there's a fraudulent activity going on, but they sort of don't take particularly proactive stance towards fraud. So potentially looking at being critical about your business processes and understanding where the potential risks of fraud is, and taking steps to proactively put controls in place to prevent fraud or to detect fraud as well. So I think that's generally just sort of because you don't worry about fraud until it happens. It's like anything bad that happens with a business, right? It's just something that you deal with once it happens. And cybersecurity is always a similar thing as well. People don't spend money on cybersecurity until they've been hacked, and then suddenly there's money for sorting out cybersecurity. Fraud is very similar. I mean, the other area to look at is the rise of artificial intelligence, the rise of deep fakes, and that's video deep fakes, it's voice deep fakes. So now you can receive a call or a video call from a known person with an instruction, but that might even be a fraudster. It might be somebody who's pretending to be the MD. Even if the video sort of matches, it might still not be that MD. So it really undermines the trust we can have in our communication channels as well. I mean, obviously that's got a wider implication for banks who used to use voice recognition on their accounts. So the new way is now to type unique identifiers and back to multi-factor authentication, where they ask you to put a code in that's been sent to your mobile device. But yeah, so I think AI is quite an interesting angle that fraudsters will start using to try and perpetrate their fraud.
Anything to add to that, Richard?
Definitely, and I think it's a sort of extension of what Moritz has said. I mean, our relationship with technology and becoming more reliant on centralized technology. I know that Elon Musk is trying to turn Twitter into essentially an everything app. And as we become more socially isolated as a result of our immersion through technology. There's studies show that the risk factors that increase vulnerability to fraud are social isolation, heavy online engagement, and a degree of financial uncertainty. I mean, working from home, at least for some of the time, for most of us, has become a fairly permanent fixture. And we're funneling more aspects of our life online, whether that's a sort of medical appointment or a pub quiz. So all of our vulnerability to fraud will increase to a degree. And we also attach that with the sort of febrile global economic political environment. There's a fairly heady mix. Sort of a more general point to that, we see that there's a fairly well-documented rise in what's referred to as misinformation or disinformation generally, the alternative facts. And it's cropping up in just about every context now. The sort of classic sector that's been riddled with it is crypto assets. I think the effect of this misinformation is that it either, or perhaps even the objective of it, is that it undermines the confidence in traditional sources of information. And so now people are becoming more inclined to follow or be influenced by sources of information that either just simply appeal to them or resonate with them in some way. And to the exclusion of sources of information that will be more methodical, fact-checked, and balanced. And in plenty of instances, that's not a problem, but it's also a sort of perfect recipe for fraud. Classic example is a sort of pump and dump scam where somebody influences you to invest in a product, price ramps up, they cash out, the whole thing drops to the floor. And that's a particular risk now in this sort of influence-based culture. And I think the final possible future or a big frontier opening up is a sort of state-sponsored hacking and cybercrime, which is seemingly becoming more and more prevalent, particularly from Russia, China, and North Korea, and sort of part of a tool of sort of pseudo warfare. Because you hear lots of accounts of state-sponsored hacking and misappropriating things from sort of crypto assets, commercial IP, and more typical just phishing and spear phishing scams. It's quite alarming because obviously it's capable of being carried out with the sort of sophistication of state-level technology and on an industrial scale. And it's targeted at individuals and companies as well. So it's likely to be very difficult to bring a wrongdoer to justice or get civil compensation or sort of get your civil remedy either, because they will be in jurisdictions where they're untouchable.
Well, thank you very much. We have run a couple of minutes over, so I will bring it to an end. Thank you so much, Marit and Richard and Ricky, who's had to exit the building. Really well attended seminar. So I think, indicative of all this that's going on and all the new emerging trends we're seeing. And I think what I'm taking away from this is prevention, and make sure you're getting the right advice up front to reduce the chances of fraudulent activity happening. So thank you all very much. If you could all fill out the feedback questionnaire, that would be super useful in helping us to shape future webinars. And like I say, it was recorded, so do share with your peers. And we've got the webinar coming up on 14th of December, which is embedding learning and development into your organisation. So hopefully see some of you there as well. So thank you all very much for attending and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. Bye-bye.